You pull out your phone, tap an app, and a satellite orbiting a curved planet tells you exactly where you're standing on it. Accurate to a few feet, sometimes a few inches if the app is feeling generous. This works because a small fleet of machines is doing complicated math about a sphere spinning through space at roughly 1,000 miles an hour. And nobody in the room questions it, not even for a second, while ordering a coffee 3 blocks away. Yet somewhere online right now, someone is uploading a video insisting all of that is theater, that the ground beneath your feet is flat, that the curve is a lie sold to you by an agency with an oddly small advertising budget for something so ambitious. The easy answer is that ancient people were simply too primitive to know better, squinting at the horizon and assuming the obvious because nobody had told them different. The real answer is stranger and considerably more interesting, because the ancients who actually studied the sky figured out the planet was round remarkably early, using nothing but shadows, geometry, and enough patience to watch the same thing happen the same way for years. The flat Earth wasn't a failure of observation. It was a starting assumption, built the same way most starting assumptions are built, from what a person can see without ever needing to check. And starting assumptions, it turns out, have a long and complicated relationship with the truth. Stand at an open field and look toward the horizon. It's flat. It stays flat no matter which direction you turn. North, south, doesn't matter. And nothing about the lived, physical experience of standing on the ground suggests you're balanced on the surface of a curve. That's not stupidity. That's just the limits of a human-sized vantage point on a very large sphere. The same way a person standing on an enormous beach ball would swear the surface under their feet was a floor. Early Mesopotamian cosmology described the world as a flat disk floating on a cosmic ocean, capped by a solid dome holding back the waters above it. A structure sometimes imagined with mountains at the edges acting like the rim of a bowl, because that's roughly what the sky looks like from ground level on a clear night, a lid stretched over a plate. Egyptian cosmology pictured something structurally similar, but dressed in different mythology entirely. A flat earth personified as the god Geb, lying prone beneath the sky, with the goddess Nut arched overhead as the heavens themselves, her body studded with stars, held up by the air god Shu standing between them like a permanent, exhausted pillar. These weren't careless guesses scratched into stone by people who hadn't thought it through. They were coherent, internally consistent models built from consistent daily observation, tested against the same sunrise and the same sunset every single day of every single year. And for people without ships crossing oceans or instruments tracking star angles across latitudes, a flat disk explained everything they could actually verify with their own eyes and their own footsteps. Here's the detail that gets skipped in the lazy, ancient people were dumb version of this story. A flat Earth model isn't unreasonable, it's just incomplete. And it's incomplete specifically because the evidence for curvature is subtle, indirect, and requires either long-distance travel, careful mathematics, or watching something patiently for years at a stretch. A farmer in one valley, tending the same fields his father tended, had no practical reason to suspect the ground curved beneath his plow. His crops grew on schedule, his sun rose in the same place every morning, his river flowed downhill exactly the way rivers are supposed to, and none of that required a spherical planet to make sense of it. A flat Earth explained his entire observable world just as well as a round one would have, at a fraction of the mental cost. Flat Earth cosmology also did something else quietly useful, something modern debates about the topic tend to forget entirely. It gave structure and shape to religious and mythological systems that people were already building their lives around. A disk with an underworld tucked beneath it and heavens layered above mapped cleanly onto stories about gods, ancestors, judgment, and the order of things, giving abstract belief a physical geography to live inside. The model wasn't just physics, in other words, it was architecture for belief, load-bearing in a spiritual sense as much as a literal one. And it held up perfectly fine for centuries, right up until someone started asking inconvenient questions with tools sharper than eyesight. Those questions started early, and mostly in Greece, where a peculiar culture of arguing about the natural world for sport happened to take root. By around the 6th century BCE, Pythagoras and his followers were already proposing a spherical Earth, partly for observational reasons and partly, bizarrely, for aesthetic ones, because they found the sphere mathematically and philosophically satisfying as the most perfect shape available. That sounds like a strange basis for cosmology, until you remember these were the same people who thought numbers themselves were sacred, and that the universe was fundamentally built from ratios. But the case for a round Earth sharpened fast once actual observation entered the argument. Sailors had long noticed something specific and repeatable, that a departing ship's hull disappears below the horizon before its mast does, the tip of the vessel lingering on the visible line long after the deck has vanished. A small, easily overlooked detail that only makes sense if the surface between observer and ship curves downward and away. Travelers moving north or south across enough latitude notice the North Star climbing higher in the sky or dropping lower, depending on direction. A shift a flat, unbending surface simply couldn't produce, no matter how far someone walked. And during a lunar eclipse, when the Earth passes directly between the Sun and the Moon, the shadow Earth casts across the lunar surface is unmistakably curved every single time, regardless of the date, the season, or the angle of approach. A flat disk tumbling edge first through that shadow at different angles on different nights would occasionally throw an oval, sometimes a line, sometimes something irregular. A sphere throws a circle. Always, without exception, night after night, for as long as anyone cared to keep watching. Then came the moment the theory stopped being persuasive and became, quite simply, a number. Around 240 BCE, a scholar named Eratosthenes, running the great library at Alexandria and apparently possessed of an unusually curious mind, even by the standards of that job, heard a curious piece of traveler's trivia. In the city of Syene, far to the south, at noon on the summer solstice, sunlight struck the bottom of a deep well straight down, casting no shadow at all along its walls, meaning the sun sat directly overhead at that exact moment. In Alexandria, on that same day, at that same hour, a vertical stick planted in the ground still cast a clearly measurable shadow, a small but undeniable angle away from straight down. That difference could only exist if the ground stretching between the two cities curved gradually away from the sun's rays, and the precise angle of that Alexandrian shadow let Eratosthenes calculate the Earth's full circumference, using nothing more exotic than geometry, sunlight, and the known walking distance between two cities, likely paced out by professional distance measurers hired for exactly this kind of civic bookkeeping. His resulting figure landed within a strikingly reasonable margin of the Earth's actual circumference, worked out without satellites, without leaving Egypt, without a single instrument more advanced than a stick and a well, using tools a patient schoolteacher could still explain on a chalkboard today in under 10 minutes. This wasn't a lucky guess dressed up afterward as science to sound impressive. It was one of the earliest recorded instances in human history of testing a claim against measurable reality, and trusting the math over the comfortable assumption of the eye. So if the sphere was mathematically settled over 2,000 years ago, thoroughly and repeatedly, where exactly did the popular "medieval people all thought the Earth was flat" idea come from? Mostly from a much later century than most people would guess. Educated scholars, monks, and astronomers throughout the medieval period overwhelmingly accepted a spherical Earth as basic, uncontroversial fact. It was taught plainly in university curricula across Europe, referenced casually in period texts, sermons, and scientific writing, not as a daring new theory, but as settled background knowledge nobody felt the need to argue about. The popular modern image of medieval Europe as a flat Earth backwater traces largely to the 19th century, when writers, including Washington Irving in his heavily fictionalized biography of Columbus, dramatized the explorer's famous voyage as a heroic battle against superstitious, flat Earth clergy, purely because that framing made for a far better story than the truth. It made for gripping narrative tension, a lone visionary defying ignorant authorities, which is a much more satisfying plot than what actually happened. Columbus's real, documented argument with the scholars of his day was over the size of the ocean he'd have to cross to reach Asia, not the shape of the planet underneath it. And by most calculations at the time, his critics were closer to correct than he was. He'd simply underestimated the Earth's circumference and gotten unreasonably lucky that an entire unknown continent happened to be sitting in his path. The myth stuck anyway, because it was simple, flattering to modern audiences eager to feel more enlightened than their ancestors, and because almost nobody bothered fact-checking a good story against the actual surviving manuscripts. That doesn't mean flat Earth belief simply vanished the moment the Greeks finished their math, tidy and complete, never to resurface. Cosmological models are stubborn things, deeply woven into identity and inherited belief, and different cultures around the world kept independently favoring flat or disc-shaped Earth concepts for centuries after the sphere was mathematically available, and, in some regions, widely taught. This often happened because those flat models were braided tightly into religious cosmology that communities weren't eager to unravel over a geometry proof delivered by outsiders. Belief, as it turns out, isn't purely a math problem. It's a social one, tangled up with scripture, tradition, and a sense of communal identity. And unweaving a cosmological model can feel less like correcting an error and more like unraveling a community's entire inherited worldview, thread by thread. Even long after solid geometric evidence had arrived and been demonstrated, some groups kept teaching flat or dome-shaped models well into periods when literate elites elsewhere had already accepted the sphere without a second thought or a raised eyebrow. The honest position here is considerably less tidy than a single, satisfying global timeline would suggest. There was no one dramatic moment when humanity collectively flipped a switch from flat to round. There was instead an uneven, centuries-long overlap, correct mathematics and comfortable cosmology coexisting side by side, sometimes within the very same city, occasionally within the very same household. Which brings us to the strange, almost paradoxical modern twist. Because flat Earth belief didn't stay safely tucked away in antiquity, where it made a certain amount of sense. It came roaring back with real organizational force in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this time, crucially, it wasn't a lack of information driving it. A man named Samuel Rowbotham built an entire flat Earth movement in Victorian England, running public experiments, publishing pamphlets, touring lecture halls up and down the country, doing all of this in an era when the Earth's shape had already been thoroughly, exhaustively settled science for well over 2,000 years. Modern flat Earth belief runs on a fundamentally different engine than the ancient version ever did. Less about genuinely limited horizons, and far more about a deep, specific distrust. A conviction that photographs can be faked, that institutions have both the means and the motive to lie at scale, and that raw, personal observation should outrank expert consensus built on tools the observer will never personally operate. It's a strange, almost elegant inversion when you look at it directly. Ancient people believed the Earth was flat largely because they hadn't yet tested it and had no particular reason to. Some modern people believe it because they've actively decided the tests themselves, and the people running them can't be trusted at all. Same conclusion, arrived at through almost entirely opposite reasoning, separated by 2,000 years and a complete reversal of the underlying logic. What actually survived from antiquity, in the end, wasn't the flat model at all. It was the habit that ultimately killed it. The specific human instinct to check a comfortable story against something cold, external, and measurable. Eratosthenes didn't win the argument by simply being more confident or more eloquent than the disk cosmology he was replacing. He won it by finding one small, stubborn shadow that flatly disagreed with the old model, and then refusing to look away from that disagreement or explain it away. That's the quieter lesson sitting underneath all of this history. Easy to miss if you're only paying attention to the shape of the planet itself. The Earth's actual shape was never really the hard part of this story. The hard part, the genuinely difficult cultural achievement, was building a habit of mind willing to trust a stick's shadow over a comfortable, inherited, emotionally satisfying assumption. That habit took root slowly, unevenly, argued over in libraries and lecture halls, corrected across generations who didn't always agree with each other, revised a little further every time somebody sailed a bit farther than expected or watched the night sky a bit more carefully than the person who came before them. So no, ancient people weren't uniformly gullible about the ground beneath their own feet. Some of them measured it, argued fiercely about it, published their disagreements, and got remarkably, almost eerily close to the right answer, using nothing more than a well, a stick, a length of rope, and one carefully chosen summer afternoon. Others simply built a workable cosmology from what they could directly see and had no particular reason to question it, which is, honestly, a very human thing to do, exactly as true today as it was several thousand years ago. And tonight, when your phone quietly and confidently confirms your exact location using math that assumes a curved, spinning, tilted planet hurtling around a star, remember that somebody worked that shape out on foot, by hand, with nothing but sunlight and geometry and stubborn curiosity, roughly 22 centuries before anyone needed a satellite to double-check their work.